Here is an author in their element, having some fun with their craft, delivering some of the best combat scenes I've read lately.
That never wanders far from my mind.
I think that this might be one of the single best representations of dragons that I've read in the fantasy genre.
This book is a dark, fascinating, disgusting, wonderful, nauseating, intriguing, effed up, heartfelt, brutal character study
that recaptures the magic of far-flung galaxies, grand ideas, and more.
There's so much this book gets right. Like any good map, you're aware of the destination it's leading you towards, but the way it takes you there is very pretty indeed.
An all-consuming dreamscape, the likes of poet Morpheus.
It's a neo-retro futuristic fest. Alien menaces, gunslinger goes hard.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 4 of TBRCon2023. Thank you to everyone who's watching this live stream and to all of you who've been supporting the convention so far this week. I'm Adrian M. Gibson. I am the host of FanFiAddict's podcast and the director of TBRCon2023. For this panel, we'll be discussing a new golden age of space opera. And with me are 5 amazing authors to help me unravel how we are indeed living in a new golden age for the genre. So I'll go through the panelists one by one and you can introduce yourselves. So starting off, Adrian Tchaikovsky.
Hello, I'm Adrian Tchaikovsky. I'm best known for writing science fiction books about spiders in outer space.
Brilliant. And for anyone who is watching and get confused by the double Adrian in this podcast, people on the panel can just say Adrian T or Adrian G or however you want to do it. Next up, we have Paul.
I'm the one with the beard.
Beard Adrian, perfect. Shaved Adrian. Next up, we have Paul McAuley.
Hi, I'm Paul McAuley. I guess space opera stuff would be the Quiet War I'm best known for, which is solar system space opera based on the actual solar system.
And full of amazing science as well.
Thank you. And
next up, we have Nia N.E. Davenport. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you? I am Nia. I write science fiction and fantasy. My debut novel just came out last April. It's called The Blood Trials. It's a science fantasy.
And the sequel is coming out in April, right?
This April, yes.
And that's the Blood Gift, correct?
It's called The Blood Gift, yes.
Yeah, excited for that. And next up, we have Aliette de Bodard. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. So I write mostly far-flung science fiction. I'm best known for the Xuya universe, which is Vietnamese-inspired science fiction with galactic space empires that are based on Confucian rather than on the Roman Empire. And the latest book I had that's come out is The Red Scholar's Wake, and it's basically lesbian pirates in outer space.
Yeah, fantastic book as well. And finally, we have Jonathan Navarre joining us. How are you, my friend?
Good, thank you. So I'm Jonathan Navarre, and I'm the author of the Windtide space opera series, which is focused on ethics, and the newly released Stellar Instinct, which is a standalone Sci-Fi space opera thriller.
Fantastic. And just a shout out to Christopher Ruocchio, who is going to join us for this panel. Got a little fender bender this morning. He's doing all right, but shout out to you, my friend. It's a bummer that you couldn't be here, but Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on at the last minute. I really appreciate it. So just to start off this discussion, I want to take a little bit of a more broad historical perspective when I say the golden age of space opera kind of thing. We were kind of joking about it a bit before starting the recording. But I want to know, when I say that, what comes to your mind? Is there an era that sticks out to you or particular authors? Adrian, I'll give it to you first.
I mean, the problem is, I guess I grew up 70s, 80s. So for me, space opera equals Star Wars as much as anything. But obviously, Star Wars itself draws from the previous 3 to 4 decades. I mean, for me, one of the biggest, most influential space operas book-wise is probably Dune, which is still, I think, probably the book from that era that I still go back to on a regular basis.
Yeah, Dune is the big one for me as well. Even though some would say, oh, it's space fantasy, Star Wars too, but, you know, genre crap and all that. But Paul, what about you? When it comes to golden age of space opera, what comes to your mind?
Well, geez, I'm a little bit older than most of the rest of you, so I probably think of the golden age of space opera as the golden age of space opera, which is the 1930s to 1950s stuff.
The true golden age.
But I didn't read much of it because most of it was unreadable pulp. It aged very badly, very quickly. But if I think of space opera again, I got to go back to the stuff I was reading when I was but a teenager or an undergraduate. And the one that sticks out, apart from Dune, which I bought in, I think, 1972 as a paperback, which said major motion picture coming soon on the cover. It's
that
been
David
a long
Lynch
time coming.
masterpiece.
Yeah, space opera is very big and very slow. This is the thing. But what I think of as space opera, I guess, is, and what I was slightly influenced by, is James Blish's City in Flight series, which had the great cities of Earth zooming through space on spin dizzies. And it was centered on the adventures of the city of well, they called it New York, but it's actually the island of Manhattan. And it was more about politics and economics than sword fights and princesses in space and that kind of stuff. Very Star Wars passed me by. I didn't even see it when it came out. So I was more a 2001 person. So that's what space opera means to me. It's cities roaming around the galaxy looking for work.
I love it. And Nia, what about you?
I was born in the late 80s. So Star Wars for me, like Adrian said, it is I think that was maybe my first formative idea of what space opera was. As I got older, I definitely found myself drawn to these big fantastical worlds set in outer space. I will admit I did not read a lot of space opera in my younger days because it felt very dense and inaccessible. And even as a younger child, I was looking to see myself reflected within those, pages as the heroes of the stories that I was reading. To me, space opera is these big fantastical stories. You get your princesses and your rival kingdoms, but you're dropping them in outer space. And I'm sure there are some significant works that came out of the true, the quote unquote golden age. But I recognize the current explosion of works coming out in the genre as today's kind of modern golden age of space opera, because I think it gives us a much more incredible wealth of representation.
Mm-hmm. Look at you, Nia, foreshadowing there. We're going to get into that. That's what this whole panel's about, baby. Aliette, what about you in terms of what you think of the golden age of space opera, whether it's movies or film, or TV or books or what have you?
Well, I mean, it's kind of hard not to mention Star Wars, right? Because there are various opinions on the latest ones, but it certainly continued to have a big impact culturally from the time that it came out in 1977 to now, right? Include, I was going to say the movies have ended, but there are the spin-off TV series, Mandalorian, and so on and so forth, which are continuing. The age, what I associate with the golden age of science fiction is, it's a very selfish and personal thing, which is what I was reading when I was growing up, and I was discovering that there was such a genre as space opera. And so it's Jan Banks, C.J. Sherry, Alastair Reynolds, and all the authors around the, I guess, 90s, 80s, that kind of thing, when I was really getting into science fiction as a teenager and young adult. So that's very much what I associate with. And I guess that's it.
No, I like it. And Jonathan?
So like Adrian, I default to Star Wars from a pop culture perspective with space opera because I'm also a 70s child, and that was my first exposure. But in terms of literature, for me, it's really Arthur C. Clarke was my kind of entry point. And I kind of tore through most of his things. And I think of that for me as really the kind of the golden age of my personal sort of entrance into space opera. And it has to do for me with scale, really. The thing about Clarke that always got me was the wonder and the sort of sublime quality of the cosmos that comes into the way that he wrote. And for me, that was what really drew me into the genre. And whether it was something as like a first contact that was close and in the solar system, like Rendezvous with Rama, or whether it was something that was much farther out and maybe more metaphysical, that was really, for me, I think, how I got in to start.
I find this so fascinating that everyone has such broad diversity of introduction into space opera. And, within the canon of science fiction, there are eras which can, people have defined as like the golden age of such and such, or the silver age, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing with comic books. But I think it's so cool that there is such a diversity of introduction, but also interest, the kinds of space opera that people gravitate towards, whether it's based on when you were born or what your particular likes are and that kind of thing. Paul, I want to ask you in particular, because you're the only one who actually brought up this period, which many regard as the golden age of space opera or sci-fi, etc. This period around like the 1930s to the 1970s kind of thing. But for you in particular, were there aspects of that era that were iconic? And if so, what are they?
No, not really. I mean, the thing is that everybody mentions Star Wars, and Star Wars is like an updating of all that stuff. It's got swords in it, it's got princesses in it, it's got palaces in flames in it, and so on and so forth. It's got gigantic structures, which space opera kind of had. I mean, the thing is that people back in the 1930s, astronomers only just were trying to grapple with the idea that we were actually in a galaxy. So things have got inflated a lot since then. So no, I don't. I mean, the only real contact I had with it was, as I say, with contemporary stuff that contemporary in the 60s and 70s, anthologies like the Brian Aldiss one and so on. Isaac Asimov did one of the old Golden Greats and things like that, or the pulp writers. That's the kind of thing I guess I remember, but only fleetingly. The stuff again, I was more influenced by, as I said, apart from Blish, was Clarke, and more the 1950s science fiction. And Aliette mentioned the 1990s stuff. This came out of the Interzone generation, I guess, British science fiction writers, Al Reynolds, myself, Stephen Baxter, and so on, who were writing what John Clute called cosmogony opera, which is like space opera, but taking into account the fact that we knew more about planets, we knew more about space and stuff like that. And it was more about the human condition, how it would be if interacted with all that stuff, rather than trying to transplant ideas of empire, and mostly British Empire, to be honest, or the American Empire, because there was such a thing, because Roosevelt was trying to promote that in the 1930s. So when you mentioned the old Star Wars, I think, in a galaxy far, far away, and I think, the pulp magazines in the 1930s, that's where it was. As far away as that, and the 1930s is a long way from where we are now.
It is. Just for the folks over in the UK, so Paul and Adrian, some people have brought up Blake's Seven. Is that something that you were familiar with growing up?
Oh, hell yeah. That was major. I mean, Blake Seven and Doctor Who were the two big British sci-fis. And Blake Seven was, as far as I'm concerned, one of the major precursors to things like Firefly and Farscape, and a lot of sort of subsequent sci-fi. I guess that was space opera. I suppose I don't think I've ever thought about it in that way. Possibly just because it was space opera on a tiny budget. But good call.
Yeah,
it was grimdark version. It was the grimdark version of Firefly, basically. It was a miserablest version of Star Wars.
Grimdark before Joe Abercrombie.
Yeah, everything was breaking down all the time and going terribly wrong, especially towards the end. It had a big twist at the ending, which meant they couldn't have a sequel. Let's put it that way. And leave it at that. Very British. Very British.
And Alan V. Chessman brought up Star Trek and Ray Bradbury and James Blish. Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles was probably, in conjunction with Star Trek, my first introduction to space opera, because my older brother was a massive, and still is, Star Trek nerd. It was basically James Bond, which Jonathan and I have bonded over. and Star Trek were kind of like the big ones for me. And he also brought up Space 1999. A lot of really, I think TV is actually one of the, especially in the 80s and 90s, was a big thing in terms of space opera, because books, it wasn't so prevalent, space opera, in my reading as opposed to my watching. But I'm curious for all of you, in terms of the things that you grew up with, the things that stand out to you, whether it's Star Wars on one end or more recent stuff like Nia and myself. What were some of the genre's biggest achievements during that time? You know, for me, there's always a lot of big intellectual concepts and explorations of these ideas. Jonathan, you brought up scope, and I think that can go in the sense of grand galactic civilizations and the scope of distance, but also the scope of time, I think is something that space opera plays with a lot, or, you know, strange and fascinating alien species. So Aliette, I'll toss it to you first in terms of the stuff that you grew up with and the stuff that you're familiar with. What were some of the big achievements of those works, the things that you remember?
Well, there's a lot of things, really. I think, I mean, the one big influence on me was Yoon Ha-lee's what would later become the Machineries of Empire, but which started as a series of short stories, notably in Clark's World, right? And I think, you know, Nia touched on it briefly, but like, to me, it was like, so Yoon brought Korean culture, like Korean inspired culture, into space opera, and it was a kind of jolt of, hey, I see something that looks like myself, because part of the way that I had grown up, and this is, you know, being not white in a mostly majority white society, is internalizing that stories mostly don't happen to people like me. And that at best, you know, the people most familiar to me were the funny aliens, the one everybody would try and annihilate or negotiate with or whatever, right? So it was a weird experience to be reading those things that I liked, that had the scope, that had the science that I was really interested in, but not really feeling like adventures and stories, the basis of it, was something that happened to people like me. So seeing Yoon do that made me think, hey, I could do things a little differently. Actually, it doesn't have to be the same kind of thing that I was reading.
And I appreciate that. And, you know, we will get into all of your own sort of your own writing and the things that drove the ideas that you wanted to put on the page. Perhaps, you know, in Aliette's your case, where you weren't finding stuff that felt like it represented you, but you saw a glimpse of it in Yoon's work. And Nia, for you, what were some of the big achievements or things that stood out to you as really memorable from the space opera that you consumed when you were growing up?
I'm a huge sucker for these ideas of like aristocracy and power struggles within space. And I think those are one of the like huge things that stood out for me, because it's one of the draws that I like about fantasy, and to see it, you know, transposed kind of like off planet, and going back to Star Wars, like kind of like how like when you can play with magic and or mysticism within space, because so much I think sci-fi on a larger scale kind of, not completely, but like kind of divorces itself from these ideas, these bigger ideas of magic, and is very much framed around like technological advancement and what, you know, the human condition looks like if we have all of this like explosion of, I guess, like a technological explosion, or if, you know, the science that we know today like evolves like light years ahead, which I love those ideas in space opera too, but I really like the idea, what does it look like if magic evolves along with, I mean, if we're on a completely different planet, why can't magic be simmering within the core of that planet, right? So that was one of the big things that draws me to space opera, not really having such like a rigid set of conditions as far as like how magic, you know, may or may not play into and shape the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Adrian, as someone who dabbles a lot in hard sci-fi and grew up a lot with hard sci-fi, what's your take on the achievements and the things that really stuck out to you? But do you also want to comment on what Nia was saying in terms of like her attraction to something more like the magic and the mysticism as opposed to the hard science kind of stuff?
Well, I mean, I think it's either an integral part of space opera, or it's certainly a very common element of space opera, that you have that added dimension that goes beyond simple kind of something you can express in a mathematical equation. I mean, I'm mentioning Dune earlier on. I mean, I think Dune is sci-fi, but it's got that big. It's got a huge bucket load of psychic powers and expanded states of consciousness, and which also feeds into there's a very big sort of spiritual religious element to the societies of Dune, and that's not something you would necessarily see in what we describe as more of a hard sci-fi, but I think it is a very common element with space opera, because space opera has room to speculate in those areas without kind of feeling that it needs to be terribly as constrained by the science as hard sci-fi. And I've done, I mean, I'm currently 2 books into a space opera series myself, and I am also doing, the mind expanding sort of psychic universal awareness stuff in that. And it's in doing so, I'm very much, I'm aware I'm part of a big tradition. And obviously, you can call it psychic powers and you can call it magic, you can call it whatever, but it does mean that there is that extra element of the inexplicable and the unexplained, which can add a lot of kind of interest and depth to your universe, rather than the somewhat mechanistic sort of certainly 30s to 60s science, certainly to like 50s 60s hard science, and that big boom of that was quite flatly rational in that particular axis.
Yeah, agreed. Jonathan, you're nodding. Do you want to get in here?
Yeah, no, I was agreeing with Adrian because I was thinking of some of the same examples, especially with Dune. Because like Nia and Adrian, I also really am drawn, I think, to the way in which mysticism and spirituality, and in general, I guess I would just call it leaving some of the aspects of some of the qualities that are built into cultures and to people's abilities, leaving those a little bit unknown and unexplained, draws me into some aspects of space opera, which is probably why I also write softer space opera, just because I'm less interested in going into the hard science and explaining out really how things work as I am how people use them. I really enjoy when other people create science fiction where they use hard science and do explain it, but personally for me, I'm more interested in leaving some of that in the realm of the unknown. And I think also for me, secondary worlds, I'm drawn to a way in which space opera can take place in a separated and divided history from Earth history. So I prefer stories that are set either in a completely secondary galactic universe or that have somehow lost their connection to Earth history. Something about that escapist quality of putting myself in another literal world like that is autonomous is very, I guess, enjoyable for me, to be able to let go of the connection to Earth. But I really do enjoy that cosmic consciousness component. Like the latest book, Stellar Instinct, has something called an egregore in it, which is a kind of a thought form, which is a kind of a higher transcendental kind of a cosmic consciousness. And I very much enjoy that idea that, whatever's out there, right, is unexplored and is most likely, hopefully, more advanced and more sophisticated than us.
Agreed. And Paul, I want to get your take on this as well. On one hand, what everyone else was talking about in terms of, through your personal experience, some of the things that you remember the most, what you would consider big achievements of the space opera that you grew up with, but at the same time, kind of transitioning what a few of the other panelists have been commenting on, which is this sort of relationship between, mysticism and things like that on one end, and then on the other hand, you have science and some of the more rigorous aspects of a lot of space opera. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I guess they're different expressions of the good old sense of wonder in a way, aren't they? And the sense of wonder is a kind of, I always thought is a kind of associated with a kind of change in scale. You know, you can see these videos where you start off with a person on Earth and it zooms upwards for a satellite view and the person shrinks down to a dot. The dot is absorbed into a city. The city is absorbed into a continent. The continent is absorbed into the great globe of the Earth. And we zoom past the moon out to the solar system. It's in the galaxy. Okay. And science fiction, you know, you can get moments of that in written science fiction. The sort of example for me is there's a story by James Blish, whose title I've momentarily forgotten, which is set in a puddle on a marshy planet where a colony ship is stranded, and the crew isn't going to survive. So they and the only way of colonizing it is to shrink the colonists down into microscopic size and infest the puddles. And they leave tablets behind, as in the Ten Commandments, explaining what's going on. And eventually these colonists in the puddles, with the help of protozoa, produce a wooden spaceship. And that crawls out of their puddle towards another puddle. And the sense of wonder comes when you zoom out and you realize that overhead, unseen, is the vast starry sky that the colonists know nothing about. But we, of course, recognize. Now that sense of wonder, and you can do that, you know, on a planetary scale, you can do that on a kind of cosmic consciousness scale or whatever. But that's the kind of thing that you can do. The trouble with sense of wonder and space opera is that space opera kind of domesticates it and uses these vast landscapes as a background too often for sort of human conflict that can happen just as well on Earth. And the other thing, I suppose, people mentioned Star Trek. The other thing I mentioned, I watched Star Trek when I was a kid, the original flavor Star Trek. And the thing about that was that it was not about conflict per se, it was about resolving conflict. That was the whole point of Star Trek. And it did make a stab, however clumsily, at inclusion and diversity. So there's a little bit of that. So that was kind of welcome as well. And that was going on at a point when I can't remember, I think it was Adrian said that there wasn't much going on in the written science fiction. It was all about inner space and that kind of stuff that was going on, the new worlds, the new wave kind of thing. And later on we had the new space opera, which was kind of like getting away from that, which I was a part of. So yeah, that's one reason why TV kind of was important then in terms of space opera, because it was kind of carrying the flag, as it were, forward until the fashions rolled around and you got the written space opera again.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Paul, you brought it up, and Jonathan, you were talking about secondary worlds. Paul, I want to get your take on this notion of using Earth as the setting, or using our solar system as a setting. And then we can expand upon that, and whoever wants to join in afterwards to kind of talk about a broader conversation of secondary world building and building upon what we know here on Earth, and whether for you personally it works better to set things in a known space or to create a space that is an analog, or at least like an extension of our own world. So Paul, I'll let you go first on that, okay?
Oh, gee, I don't think it's better to do one or the other. It just depends on what the writer does. Okay.
It's all
From
personal preference.
my point of view, and the Quiet War stuff is like, I was writing at a time when all these little robots were going out, or had gone out and taken these fantastic views of the planets and the moons of the outer system. And there was such a mad diversity of landscapes in the moons of Saturn and Jupiter, and so many moons as well. You know, Jupiter and Saturn have both got like 8, I think I've lost count of how many, it's like 80 each. There's like a rivalry. They keep discovering new moons. And they're all lots of them now are obviously little tiny, as opposed to the sort of classic 4 moons of Jupiter and the few big moons, the big moon Titan of Saturn and the smaller icy moons. But still, there's this huge diversity of landscapes. So I was wondering, well, how do you live on those? And how would that affect people living on those? And the thing is, you didn't really need to imagine it. It was kind of like the stuff that Stan Robinson was doing on Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars. And he did have a section, I think, in Green Mars, where one of the Martians went out and visited all the colonies in the outer planets and touched on the diversity of life there. And I thought, well, you don't have to make this stuff up. They're sitting there. You kind of have to make up how people are living there, but you can try and get across the reality of how it was to live on a icy moon where Saturn was looming above you, what it was like to live on the sort of frozen methane landscapes of Titan and so on. So I was doing that rather than making up worlds. And I kind of got into the exoplanet stuff as well with the Jackaroo universe. And because we're busy discovering all these exoplanets, this big zoo of weird worlds actually exist. We don't know much about them, but we know their orbits and roughly their size and so on. And I kind of wanted to explore that. What have we got out amongst those? And that kind of mixed up with aliens, which we haven't touched on, by the way, in space opera.
We will.
But anyway, I'll shut up there and just sort of leave that hanging.
No, I like it. Just a quick aside. Nia Prince Podcast says in the comments, salute to you, knee deep in reading the Blood Trials, and they're enjoying it very much. You brought up earlier, do you want to build on what Paul said? Because earlier you were saying like secondary worlds, the appeal that they have to you, but when it came to your own writing, what was the appeal of creating that from whole cloth?
I really like, just personally, like there's no one right or wrong way, like whatever is your flavor, but I just really like the idea of freeing up my imagination when I am writing. I'm very much like, I love reading hard sci-fi, but I don't necessarily like writing it. If I'm working on like a world building element or like a setting element, and I like being able to say this is a thing because of magic, or this evolved because of some historical occurrence in the secondary world's history that has now made what you're seeing on the page in like real time come about. And in secondary worlds, I think it's a little bit easier to do that when we don't have Earth's history to have to kind of like reconcile with and make sure the timeline somewhat reasonably flows from how did we get to what we see today to how did we get to this far future world that still has a connection back to Earth. I really enjoy playing with things like gods and religion and magic in my works, especially like I'm a child who grew up watching things like, and this is probably just wildly like, they probably did not age well at all, but I remember being like 7 or 8 and my aunt would have me watching like Xena and Hercules and Atlantis. And those are like the types of really big mythology based stories that have stood with me, and I think laid the foundation for my love of like fantasy-esque literature. And then, so a lot of the times when I'm writing and when I'm coming up with new worlds, those types of mythological ideas are still with me. And I'm like, yes, I want, the sword and sorcery and the mythology, but it'd be really cool to like blend in some cool like tech elements. That's how I most of the time get to, we're going to put this in space.
I love it. Also, I adored Xena and Hercules. Those cheesy ass 90s shows were so fantastic. Adrian or Aliette, do you want to get on this conversation of different approaches, whether it's secondary worlds and far-flung galaxies, that kind of thing, or rooting it more in our own solar system?
I mean, I do, but I mean, Aliette, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I have a day job, and my day job is I am an engineer and I write software for signal system in trains. And so basically my day job is a lot about playing with science and seeing what the possibilities are concretely in a kind of, 2 to 3 year term, maybe. And I guess when I'm writing, I kind of feel like I don't want to do that, right? So and somehow when I'm going around playing in the backyard, as it were, of Earth, and it's in the solar system and our planets, I get this feeling, I guess, that I'm doing day job again. Go figure. It's not like I'm launching a train around Jupiter or anything, but brains being what they are. So I kind of really want to differentiate what I'm doing And so when I'm writing, I tend to prefer going for something that is in the far-flung galaxy, that is in an alternate universe, that is somewhere that is not here. And as you know, as everyone was saying, I don't think there's a right or wrong approach, right? It's just what happens to work for me. And what I really like, the kind of setting it in a far-flung galaxy, playing with a whole bunch of possibilities. I just feel it frees me to play with a whole bunch more possibilities and a whole bunch more, like, one of the things that I'm really interested in is having societies that operate on completely different principle and different familial structures, different political structures, and I feel that's more possible setting in a far-flung galaxy. And I realize, you know, intellectually speaking, I could probably set that in orbit around Saturn. There's no reason I couldn't, but it just feels very difficult psychologically. And over the years, I have learned not to argue with my brain. Do not want to piss off the muse. Whatever works, whatever works. And the other thing that I wanted to do is, to me, there's a kind of mythical quality about science fiction and fantasy, in the sense that about space opera, in the sense that I think I came to it via Star Wars, which basically like takes those archetypes and puts them in space and draws part of its power as a story from those archetypes. You know, there's the farm boy who goes into space, there's the dark father, there's all sorts of very familiar things that are put on spaceships, for want of a better word. And part of what I'm trying to do when I write is also to play with some of these. And again, to me, it feels easier to do that when I'm doing it in a far-flung galaxy, and I have a lot more freedom to go like, hey, here's a weird planet. I'm not going to have to justify whatever happened to Saturn or Jupiter to explain why I have a weird planet, which would get very complicated. I also feel, you know, I think if I were to try that, I can like mentally see how that would go, which is that I would have to like write so this happened and this happened, and then I would need to research orbital mechanics and write a whole précis of like the previous 15 centuries of Saturn's history, which I don't have to do if it's in a far-flung galaxy. I can just go like, hey, here are some Trojan asteroids, go. So to me, I think that's how it works.
That makes total sense. Adrian, you're nodding. Take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I think to build very much on that, I think there is a sweet spot between a full-on secondary world where the rules can be completely different, and writing in our kind of in our science fiction backyard within the solar system, because I think I tend not to write within our solar system. I tend to go for exoplanet and far-flung stuff, because it's less research heavy, because I don't have to know enough, and because someone is not going to turn up and tell me that the astrogeology of Titan doesn't work that way. And by someone, I mean my dad, who teaches this stuff for the Open University. But I also think that there is a definite value to having a connection to Earth, having the idea that what you're writing about is in the future of our culture, our sort of, it's in our universe. I mean, I think if I had just written, say, Children of Time as something completely fantastical of, yes, it's a planet of giant spiders, rather than this is a planet of giant spiders that have arisen using the rules that we accept for governing evolution and spiders and things like that, it would not have had a tenth of the impact. I think the idea of it connecting in that way is something that gives a lot of science fiction its power. Not that it is going to happen, but purely because it conceptually exists within the same sort of real space as we do.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that you brought up, Jonathan, which is that you like this idea of kind of expanding it beyond our immediate environs, but having this connective tissue to humanity and humanity's past. Do you want to comment on what's been said, but also at the same time kind of elaborate on some of the other aspects of space opera that really appeal to you, that compelled you to write in this space?
Sure. Nia, did you want to say something? Did I see you?
Oh, so I was just going to piggyback off of what Adrian said. And
okay. Nia, and then Jonathan after.
I think even when we're like building up space operas with completely secondary worlds, Adrian is definitely right. Like you can't 100% like divorce the story from real world analogs and things that have happened in the real world, informing even those completely, in my mind, when they are completely secondary, it's still rooted within reality.
And perhaps that comes through with using humans as characters, even though it's set in a far off galaxy or a planet or what have you. Jonathan, go for it.
So with regard to the secondary worlds, I really, as a writer, I really enjoy crafting origin stories. And so for me, I like to wrap a particular novel in a origin story blanket. Really, that's often written just for me, but I really enjoy crafting the epic. And so having the freedom to literally sort of craft a civilization's history and then drop in little nuggets throughout the story as a kind of historical sort of just reminder and a kind of giving the reader a sense of the vastness of time that has passed that's led to the moment of the actual narrative, for me, is very enjoyable. And so I think that's one of the things about a secondary world that gives me the ability to not have to do what everyone's been saying, which is somehow make the link back to Earth history, even if it's thousands of years in the future, but just to be completely liberated. And I like that. And I also really like the idea of having the ability to craft the structures of power, particularly the structures of social life and of cultural conventions in different settings and different planets, without having to go through the process of explaining how they've either been revised, dismantled, or reconstructed over time, but to rather just sort of build from scratch a particular structure and really then play around with the experimentation of, well, what does this structure offer? And use that as a jumping off point for some imaginative creations that can come up that maybe might not take place if I'm thinking through a kind of a structure that's connected to the primary world. So that was my thought on the first part. And to be perfectly honest with you, Adrian G, I do not remember the second question that you asked.
I thought we agreed. It's shaved, Adrian. Get it together, man.
Shaved Adrian, sorry. I was so absorbed with what bearded Adrian was saying that
You forgot about my lack of facial hair.
Forgot about, What was the second part of the question?
What are some other aspects that really drew you to space opera? What are some things that you were able to explore within the genre that compelled you to write your stories?
I guess for me, I really enjoy when there's either a hybrid genre or a hybrid or a hybrid world building going on within space operas. So like in the contemporary moment, someone like, Arkady Martin using Byzantine and Mesoamerican history and culture as a kind of an architecture and a foundation to then construct a galactic empire is really interesting to me. So authors who are doing that today, I really find very exciting. And there's a history of that. I mean, for me, even going back to like the Stars, My Destination, looking at the Count of Monte Cristo and things like that, and how you kind of take these structures or these other stories or historical sources and then include them into a space opera setting really interests me. Even like taking a spy secret agent trope, and kind of thriller narrative and dumping that into a space opera setting for me is really exciting and interesting. So that's something that inspires me. And I did that in the Windtide series with ancient Greek texts, particularly looking at a number of different ones and then kind of using that as the foundation to then reconstruct a similar narrative, but in an entirely different context.
Yeah. And Aliette, you did something in a similar sort of vein where you're drawing on your Vietnamese history and creating the Universe of Xuya as sort of this this space opera setting and this thing that you weren't finding in the genre or in sci-fi as a whole. So for you, how was it was it really compelling for you to be able to have that connection to your own history, but also the flexibility to put it in there?
Yeah, no, to me it was, it was the stories that I grew up with, right? The stories that my grandmother was telling me when I was visiting her and the stories that I went to bed with. So, the fairy tale stories, the country stories that I got told as a child. So to me, it was kind of, when I wanted to build a society, I was like, well, the touchstone doesn't necessarily have to be anything that would be, I mean, it doesn't have to be, I don't know, French, or like Paul was talking about American and British empires, right? So I was like, actually, it doesn't have to draw on those things, and I'm not sure I could draw on those things because they don't I mean, I could from, you know, purely intellectual standpoint, but they don't speak to me the way that the Vietnamese empire speaks to me. So I really wanted to write those stories where you have scholars who are the officials and who hold the power, where family is very important, where food also plays a huge part, where there's all sorts of complications against, you know, language and loss of language, which I guess isn't strictly Vietnamese, but is also something of a diaspora preoccupation. Especially, I'm second generation, right? My mom came over, and I'm the one who was born in the West, right? So the kind of interplay between cultures and the way that you can change, and you can have that feeling of loss and that feeling of things changing was something that I also wanted to put into space, I guess. And to me, it was very important to then draw on this to get, for instance, you get, so I have the minds who are the sentient spaceships, and they're not like built by corporations. They're basically hosted and built by their families. They become part of the family, and they serve the empire as transport in much the same way that scholar officials used to serve the empire in the Vietnamese empire, well, kingdom/empire around the 15th century, but for most of its history, really, right? So these were things that were really important to me, and I kind of, I'm very happy when I get readers writing to me who also go like, it was really nice to see that in space, and to see that you had you were telling this kind of story that's more familiar to us as well. So it was really nice to be able to provide that shock of recognition to other people.
Yeah, that's good. Just to have that connection for them as readers, and for you as a writer, writing stuff that you're passionate about. And speaking of scholars, Paul, I know you have a background in biology and botany. You mentioned aliens earlier. What are some things that really appeal to you about writing in space opera, but at the same time, like infusing your own academic knowledge and that kind of stuff into the worlds that you create?
Well, as to aliens, I mean, I guess the thing is that they're not knowable. I mean, then they're not creatures. They're not humans with rubber ears or whatever. They are alien. They're peculiar and strange. There's just been a little publicity about an experiment done in my old University of St Andrews about humans understanding the gestures of chimps and bonobos and so on. And it turns out that actually we know more about what they're communicating with each other than we thought, because those gestures seem to be rooted in our gestural language as well. But they're very close cousins. We think of them as not human or not quite human, but they're very, very close cousins. I mean, we diverged a while ago, but we diverged from the same common ancestor. So we're only one common ancestor away from chimps and so on. The aliens are like a completely other thing, you know. So in some senses, you can make whatever you want and explore what life can do and what is life. How do you define life? Which is the thing in biologists have trouble. Well, you don't have trouble doing. It's a question that actually doesn't make any sense to biologists, because you can point and say that's alive, that's not alive, and then people say, yeah, but what about viruses? Are they alive or not? And the boundary is just fuzzy, so there's you can explore that fuzziness in science fiction in a way you can't really as science. I guess that's the way of saying things, and I think that's true for a lot of disciplines in science as well. You know, the fuzziness is where the fun is for a science fiction writer. And but the point I'm trying to make is that the aliens I like writing about are enigmatic. That they have their own agenda, and they also probably know more about us. They can see us more clearly than we can see ourselves, which I think is always a troubling way. There's a James Tiptree story, and I found myself And I woke on the cold hillside. It's a quote from a Shelley poem, I think, which is about the fact that human beings are tremendously sexually attracted to any aliens they see. It's our kink. It's our thing we didn't know we had until we went out in space. And we become their sex slaves, basically. And it's to the point of somebody who willingly becomes a sex slave, which is a horrible thought, as you know, in human context. But that's what aliens can do to us. And it's like, oh, yes, we're not that kind of Campbell humans as the kind of dominant species in the galaxy, which is the Campbellian which is, I guess, the old space opera notion as well, that the galaxy would be the human playground, human empires would rise and fall in the galaxy, untroubled by any other species. We would be top dog. No. So there we go. That's the kind of inversion of the old space opera that I like.
Yeah, if William Shatner's rendition of Captain Kirk taught us anything, aliens are sexy.
Yeah, well, this is the point.
Yeah, Adrian, do you wanna build on top of that, but also kind of elaborate on some things that really compel you to write in this genre?
I mean, I very much made my little stake in the genre by writing as from alien as protagonist, or certainly as from non-human as protagonist. And when I was growing up and reading sci-fi and watching sci-fi, I was always far more interested in the aliens, which were almost always either incidental background characters or inherently presented as inferior to the humans or the bad guys or whatever, but they were always so much more interesting than whatever the humans were doing. And I wanted to know, you know, if you had, I don't know, to go back to like a really old and profoundly problematic space opera, if you had Flash Gordon and you had a lizard man in Flash Gordon, I was far more interested to know, well, what's the lizard man's deal? I'm not really interested in Flash Gordon. He's very dull, but the lizard man looks great. Why don't we find out more about him? Oh, he's been shot. And that's kind of, I came up with that idea of just, I wasn't really interested. I was never looking where you were supposed to be looking with these things. I was always far more interested with the stuff that was just off the page or off the screen. And that's kind of then what I went on when I finally got the opportunity to do sci-fi. I got to write about sci-fi from the perspective of the giant spider, sci-fi from the perspective of the robot dog, of the AI, that kind of thing. And that's a thing that is a uniquely science fiction thing. That's a thing that no other genre can really do in the same way. And I mean, I'm massively into things like speculative evolution, the idea, well, what would aliens be like? What would be the commonalities they share with us, because evolution has a certain logic to it that would work independent of individual biochemistries. What would be different? All of that kind of just enormously fertile ground is a thing that science fiction can do, and you can do it hard sci-fi, you can do it space opera, you can do all manner of stuff with it. And that's just kind of, that's the fun. That is the fun stuff that I get to do, and I'm profoundly grateful for it.
Yeah. And I'm grateful for it too, to be able to read all your stories. And Nia, what's your take on this in terms of the things that compel you, really speak to you when it comes to what you're able to achieve as a writer in these space opera, science fictional playgrounds?
Hey, Paul, fellow biologist here. It was very cool listening to you talk about how how you being a biologist plays into your work. I feel like a lot of the things I do are very much like based in like, I was a biology major with like a theater minor, so like I'm always like marrying like this like duality of like scientifically like scientific world building with more like fantastical elements. And I think one of the fun things that I like doing with space operas and science fantasy in like general is creating histories and characters. And I'm like, the Blood Trials has a whole segment of people who, they have these magical traits that are inherited via these very Mendelian genetics inheritance patterns. That's used to explain why, even though this empire has tried to squash the magic within this population, how these recessive genes are still popping up. decades later, and so you get my main character who has inherited this recessive gene, and it explains why she has magic in this far off planet world. Why she has to hide it, because the powers that be were not as scientifically smart as they thought they were. But it's just, I really like being able to look at, I guess, the human to human struggles and clashes. And I know, space operas and sci-fi, they don't have to be centered around, the human condition or the human struggle. You can definitely branch out to alien species, but what draws me is looking at human relationships, our challenges, our struggles, all of our outlandish drama and tension that we have with one another, for a better or worse. One of the other things I think space opera gives me the freedom to do, I really love throwing in romantic subplots into my sci-fi fantasy. And just because space opera is so framed around human relationships, it's just a very fun playground to be okay, we're falling in love, but we're falling in love while we're on, while we're going on this grand adventure, through space or in space. Or you have these two Titan brothers feuding, but they're coming in this very classical fantasy type clash, but they're clashing over who gets to control this planet or this galaxy. And so I guess that's a very long-winded way of saying I thoroughly enjoy making the stakes and what's in, I guess, what the main characters stand to lose or gain literally be weighing on either the salvation or the destruction of an entire galaxy. That puts an incredible weight on your main character's shoulder, to be I'm not just gonna destroy my realm or my scope of a planet. I'm gonna destroy literally everything if I screw up.
Yeah, for sure. And I really appreciate hearing all of your different perspectives, because to me, what that signifies, this is a panel about a new golden age of space opera. Nia, you alluded to it at the beginning. All of the different perspectives that each of you are bringing, and all of the various authors who are writing in this space, are bringing so much to space opera and are experimenting with it in really exciting ways, and enhancing on the things that older space opera classics or just genre tropes and things like that, subverting them or bringing new things to the genre that I think the genre was perhaps missing before, or was not fully fleshing out in ways that were satisfying to a wider variety of readers. So I want to get your opinions on, looking at today. Jonathan, I'll go with you first. What makes our current age of space opera exceptional?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious answer to start with is that as we've expanded, I think generally with acceptance and with diversity, right, and inclusion in culture, I think that that's made its way into fiction, which is wonderful. And I think that that needs to continue, but I think that that's a really exciting thing that's happening within the genre. So I think that the more that we see, whether it's in world building or whether it's in the cultural relations and constructions within the settings and the stories, I think that the more that that's expanding, the more exciting works we're seeing come out into the field, without a doubt. And I think that the more we increase the diversity of voices too, the more we get new creative imaginings by far. And that's really exploding right now. And that's wonderful to see and really exciting. I also think that just in addition to that, I think as technology keeps advancing, I think we need to just think about how people are using that as a kind of a prompt for new inventiveness. And, you know, I was thinking about what we were just talking about with aliens, which I do not particularly write non-human narratives very much.
But you got challenged on it.
But I got challenged, and I did in the standalone. But like Nia, I'm very focused on human interactions and relations within secondary worlds. But I do think it's very interesting to think about how we've come so far in the way that we use non-human species in space opera and in science fiction in general to help us have an awareness of our own limits. And that's, to me, what's so profound about when aliens are done well by other authors, is when I can be taken outside of my own condition and be able to look back and see humanity from another species' eyes and from their minds. I think that that's a profoundly enlightening experience, and I think that that's one of the really interesting things that science fiction authors can do. I mean, I'm even thinking, like, to go from somewhere, like, very problematic example, but from Planet of the Apes up to today with, like, Ruth Anna Emery's A Half-Built Garden, which isn't necessarily space opera, it's a first contact book, but it's just the richness and the way in which the contemporary moment has fed into someone's ability to think about what a first contact scenario looks like and how we're perceived and what our limitations are even in an advanced state is really exciting. So it's a bit of a ramble, but that's kind of, for me, what I think is very exciting, along with, I think, the examples, like I mentioned, A Memory Called Empire, but there's so many others of authors who are writing today who I think are just bringing in a broader cultural, maybe, foundation to how they're building primary and secondary worlds in the near and far future.
Right on. That was a good ramble. Don't worry. Aliette, what's your take in terms of some of, what you find so exciting about this current age of space opera? Why you think it's really excelling and building upon what came before?
I mean, I think, like, we have already talked about the fact that, there is overall more diverse representation. I think mostly, I mean, one of the pitfalls of saying that is that there's a temptation to just ignore everything that went on before, and there were always people writing those books. It's just they were seldom published by Big Five. They seldom had such an impact, right? You have A Memory Called Empire winning a Hugo, for instance. So you get that kind of reception behind it, and that in turn opens the way for other people to follow, which I think is a big sea change in terms of, I guess, the playground in which this is happening. It's also gone more mainstream, I think, in the sense that there are more and more people who know what space opera is. I mean, I guess we can thank Star Wars for that, but not just that, right? There's we've had TV series like The Expanse. We've had, what's the name of that? Scavengers, maybe, the Korean.
Scavengers, yeah.
Oh, Space Sweepers.
Space Sweepers.
Space Sweepers, right? So you get movies like that, and so you get a sort of gestalt of, like, space opera and science fiction set in space in general that's really entering a space where a lot of people know what it is, and that in turn also creates a lot of space for publishing books and other media, comics, TV series, etc., games, which will appeal to a larger amount of people or to a smaller amount of people, right? It leaves more room. So I think you kind of see, for me, a kind of, I guess, a blossoming of the space and the spaces in general. And the other thing that I see is that you see more and more genre bending, right? Nia was touching on it with, like, she's bringing fantasy into those fantasy tropes into science fiction. You get Lovecraftian horror, right? I'm thinking of Cassandra Caw here. You get romance, Verena Maxwell's Winter's Orbit and Ocean's Echo, which is the second one. You get retellings of history, like Eliot's Unconquerable Sun. You've always had mystery, I guess, but you get also like more and more of those police procedurals and various different kinds of mystery. We've had like Muriel Lafferty's locked room mysteries in space as well. So you get a wide range of genres making their way into space opera. And I don't know, I mean, one way of thinking of it is like making their way, and the way that I think of it is like the boundaries of it keep expanding, and I think it's also really, really great, and it brings a lot of new things to well, I guess to enjoy as a reader and to play with as a writer.
Yeah, for sure. And I appreciate that you brought up video games. Mass Effect is probably the quintessential space opera in my lived experience. I adore that series so much, and I have a few author friends who I've chatted about it ad nauseum, but I think it captures a lot of what makes space opera really special. And Alan Chessman in the comments said self-publishing as well.
Yeah.
The expansion of self-publishing, including authors like Jonathan, have also expanded the genre exponentially. So Aliette, it's like you mentioned genre bending. I think that expansion is going on, but also a lot of that genre bending is going on within the self-publishing space. And a lot of experimentation can go on there as well, because
and
obviously the publishers have less flexibility.
Small presses as well.
Exactly.
I also wanted to mention small presses, but also self-publishing for sure.
Adrian, do you have any thoughts on this, but also your kind of general perception on our current golden age of space opera?
Yeah, I mean, I can only support everything that's been said so far. I would just add, I think we're in an era where people are genuinely more interested in space in the future. People are becoming far more aware, both in hope and trepidation, of where we're going as a species. People are talking about things like asteroid mining is a mainstream topic of conversation and not just a fringe sort of sci-fi nerd thing. And I think that is a tide that lifts all the boats as far as science fiction writing goes. It just means that the conceptual barrier that people have to get past to deal with any kind of science fiction idea is that much smaller, because people are already there to a certain extent. And I think most especially because that tide is now lifting a far, far more diverse float of writers than it might have done in earlier eras. We're getting this incredible explosion of thought-based ideas. So we've got people like Anne Leckie and Yoon-Ha Lee, we've mentioned, Arkady Martin, Tamsin Muir, even writing the most remarkable
goth punk space opera.
just this incredible wealth and richness of ideas that are out there, which I kind of think is actually might genuinely be unprecedented, just purely because we have a far greater demographic of people who are writing it at that very highly sort of publicized and successful level.
Yeah. And Paul, what are your thoughts, since you grew up on an older generation of space opera works, but you also entered into the space opera game earlier than anyone else here? How have you sort of seen the shift of this genre, and what are some of the things that really stand out to you?
Well, I was thinking actually when we were earlier, our first question was what was our earlier influences, and I completely forgot to mention Samuel R. Delany, who wrote space opera, who, although he was associated with the New Wave and New Worlds and so on, he wrote space opera adjacent, or indeed space opera itself, the Einstein intersection, not the Einstein intersection, sorry, Babel 17, and Nova, and so on, and also Joanna Russ, who wrote stories about a barbarian fighter who was a woman, Alex, set in ancient Greece, kind of an ancient Greece. It was and then fell through a time hole and ended up as the escort for a bunch of effete space tourists to get them across a war-torn planet, which was a very odd thing indeed. It's Picnic on Paradise, it was called. Everything being very ironic in those days, as things are. And those were my first sort of idea that things could be other than blokes talking about blokish adventures in space. And there's a lot more. Obviously, there's a lot more of it now. So much stuff that it's everybody can mention their favorites and list 10 or 12, and there's going to be very little overlap. So it's really one of those things. Maybe the definition of a golden age is you just can't keep up with all the good stuff.
Perhaps, yeah. Do you think people back
I
in
don't
like
know.
the 30s or 40s or 50s?
A couple
were
of
thinking
shout
about it?
outs. I mean, Alistair Reynolds wrote some space pirate stuff, set in the far future of what is possibly the demolished solar system, but he never says. There's the Revenger trilogy. And I kind of enjoyed a new writer's book, Simon Jimenez's The Vanished Birds, which is a very odd, starts off with a kind of odd, some kind of colony planet of peasants, basically, and sort of expands from there. And it's like a first contact with a higher intelligence, but it's really just the same civilization. It takes colonialism into some very interesting places, which is another big, theme of space opera that we have. This is very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, Alan V. Chessman in the comments saying advancements in technology, especially AI, are also driving innovative writing of space opera. I would kind of tie that into what Adrian mentioned about the general larger fascination with space, with things like SpaceX and just I think popular news portraying space with the James Webb Telescope or SpaceX launches, regardless of how much such and such news outlet like shits on any one billionaire or not. But I think the technology is cool because it feeds into the science fiction, and then the science fiction writers then extrapolate on that in fantastical settings, and that can in turn come back and influence in this feedback loop of creativity to the scientists and the people who are working in robotics or AI or what have you.
I would even add VR. I would even add VR to that too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, you can now go on the internet. You can find photos taken by 2 American robots that are trundling around Mars. Taken this very day. What they're, you can see what they're up to, and it gives you a very granular view of a very different other planet, which is very familiar in many ways. And this is the odd thing about the solar system. You see these landscapes. I don't know if you saw the pictures of one of the comets close up that another robot took. And it turns out it's got dunes and cliffs and features that look very familiar, but they're made of ice and methane and so on. Mars has got dunes as well, obviously, and rocks and mountains. Is a geologist's paradise, completely, as far as we know, lifeless, and everything's shaped by 4 billion years of wind and very slow weathering. But the point is that these little robots are just trundling around, and we can look right now and get a little kick of sense of wonder at these strange little panoramas that they take.
A little dopamine hit of creativity and awe and wonder and everything like that. And Nia, what about you in terms of, you brought it up at the very beginning, how you feel like everything that you kind of been introduced to over the course of your lifetime, you're living in what you feel like is a golden age of space opera. So for you, what are the things that really stand out to you as making this generation of space opera so exceptional?
This one has been brought up, but I really like how writers that have been traditionally gatekept out of the genre are seeing more opportunities, and I feel like self-publishing and the indie space have 100% like helped with that by pushing boundaries. I really like that. Yes, Dune is a great story, but we also know it's one of those, like, there's definitely problematic, conversations around it. And I like that in this age, and not just with Dune specifically, but with, a wealth of like space opera stories, how readers and writers, and just anyone engaging with the content, they are challenging the stories to think critically about the representations and the identities and the themes that they're playing with, even especially when they're like analogs from real life, and just I think there are great conversations around like portrayals and depictions, and how genre stories can either reinforce certain stigmas or like subvert them. And I really love the push that we're seeing and for like genre stories, I guess, to like evolve into like their best form, if that makes sense. And to, further positive conversations. And I don't mean everything has to be like peaches and roses, because, you can, display, the bad things. But what I mean is that there's this push for, works to not necessarily say something positive, but not, I guess, reinforce certain stereotypes, or reinforce certain like damaging imagery, in service of like perpetuated tropes that have, you know, been handed down, and so
Mhm.
we're starting to like subvert those a lot, and I really love that. My kids are part of this like Gen Z and beyond like generation, and I really like that generation, like they will see a piece of media or read something and immediately like start ripping down all of the like negative like are like, you know, damaging like content, and can have like these incredible like conversations, and I feel like that's, you know, that's, we're seeing that trend among like a lot of the different like age groups and like pockets,
Mhm.
of genre consumers, and I really like that. Foundation is, I'm not sure if that's like a space opera or not, but or maybe it fits in like kind of like
Yeah.
that genre.
Foundation for me is a big space opera.
Oh,
Yeah.
but I do know that I will admit I've never read the actual text, but I've started watching the Apple series, and I
Mhm.
really love that. Foundation is a series that like me as like a sci-fi lover, and you know the kids that I teach as sci-fi lovers too, that they can engage with that type of work, and that the showrunners have, you know, made the choice to like infuse it with more like diversity than perhaps formerly. I know there's a lot of controversy around this new era of Star Wars and what they try not to do too. But I I can at least pseudo appreciate the attempt of, you
Yeah.
know, representation that they try to make, even if it may or may not have been fumbled. Like I appreciate that this new age is trying to figure out how to make an effort. Yeah.
Mhm. And for me, one of the biggest things is this effort, for the most part, comes through character. And Nia, you brought it up earlier in terms of the appeal to you of these human relationships and the characters that you create and the focus that you put on them. I think for me personally, um, Adrian, don't hate me on this. A lot of old sci-fi, especially like the harder stuff, you know, even coming into more recent works in the last like 20, 30 years, what have you, character often suffered a little bit in terms of its attention.
Wait, I don't hate
There
you for that. I absolutely agree.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we're on the same page. All right, shaved and beard, we're on the same page. Um, there was a lot of focus on the big ideas, the world building, and things like that at at the cost of characters that were relatable or engaging. And so I feel what for me is really definitive about this new era of space opera, and for me why it's a golden age, is because the characters are so fascinating. You have, Adrian's work where you can relate to a spider POV, or Aliette's work where you can connect with a mind ship, a sentient spaceship, and have that emotional and empathetic connection. So I want to get all of your takes, just as a way to kind of wind this panel down, on this notion of character and the ways in which new space opera and new science fiction stories are really excelling at opening the door to characters that people can relate to. And this kind of ties into what we mentioned about diversity of writers and diversity of ideas, also opening the door to diversity of readers who can relate to any given work. So Jonathan, I'll start it off with you. Okay.
Sure. It's funny. I was sitting here thinking we've gone all this time and we haven't talked about characters. So I'm really happy. I'm really happy we're talking about it. As a character-driven space opera author, for me, character is everything, and everything in a way is built to create the conflicts and the obstacles in a character arc. So whether it's the world building, the setting, everything, the moral issues that go in, or the ethical issues that go into the plot line, all of that for me is built around character.
Mm-hmm.
And so really, all the richness that comes out of the space opera for me is food to be consumed for a character driven experience for the reader. And that's really just in short, what my motivation is as an author. And the other thing is trying to be as prudent and as diverse as possible in thinking about characters in a crew, in a cast, so that while people might be put into the POV, right, of a particular person or a particular MC or MCs that they may not fully identify with, and that's a wonderful thing when it's done well, but that they may find someone in that story that they do identify with, so that they kind of inhabit that world not only through the POV of the writer and that character that they've written, but they also inhabit that world in a kind of vicarious way. That's really, for me, something I'm often very much thinking about. How can I have a reader have a vicarious experience in this secondary world, while also maybe going through all of the struggles and all of the trials and all of the accomplishments, hopefully at the end, because I do like to end on hope whenever possible, in the story itself.
Agreed. And Adrian, what about you in terms of your approach to characters, what you're seeing in terms of character-driven stories, or at least more attention paid to characters?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are in an era where the genre is still delivering all of those big ideas, both kind of like sort of science ideas and social science ideas, that the genre that science fiction has been built on, but they are very much being used to tell stories, to tell more character-focused stories. I mean, I meant to mention Tamsin Muir and the Nocturne books are all sort of, they are a study in the relationship webs between all of these very disparate characters. And Becky Chambers is another author where she's telling very science fiction stories that deal with very science fiction ideas, but at the same time, they are all to do with the way that the characters interrelate. And I mean, I will say Aliette's books, I think, are also phenomenally good examples of how you can blend all of these aspects without actually any of them losing out. It's not, that it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah, I agree. And Aliette, I'll toss it to you. We spoke when we did an interview back in November just about this concept of intimacy. And Jonathan, you brought up scale as something that really spoke to you about space opera. And I think it's so cool that now we're seeing not only is there expansive scale going outward into the breadth of ideas and locales and the imagination of authors, but also the scale going downward into intimacy and relationships and the connection between characters. So do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think to me, it's always been, the characters have always been very important, right? I mean, I do love the world building and the aspect of like imagining different societies, but to me, it doesn't mean very much if you don't actually have people involved. And part of the thing that I enjoy is, people fundamentally remaining people in the sense that they may have very different preoccupations, very different ways of thinking, very different ways of embodiment, right? I do have a spaceship that can literally be anywhere with holographic projections, and that doesn't quite have the same idea of a body because she has lots of spots everywhere as extensions of her actual ship body. But to me, the interest in what I'm writing is always a focus on like very different characters and the way that they can inhabit those spaces, the way that those spaces can feel lived in, and the way that those different characters can interact with each other. And part of the thing that really fascinates me is how you can have two or more different characters having to come to terms with each other, and with their very different ways of experiencing the world, their very different priorities, their very different time and space scales, because, this being SF. And what I was trying to do with the Red Scholar's Wake was, to basically retain a big, large-scale science fiction space opera background, but to actually tell a story that was fairly intimate in the sense that it focused on two women and the relationship that blossoms between those two women and the second chance they both get at having a happily ever after.
And then you even have, the intimacy of this mind ship being sentient and people being inside of the mind ship. And it's like the intimacy of community within this living this living entity, which I thought was really, really cool.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Paul, just building on something that Adrian mentioned, this kind of notion that the big ideas have not gone away. There's still a lot of exploration of scientific concepts and big ideas while marrying that with more modern narrative focuses like character development and relationships and something and stuff like that. And that's something that I think you've done a really good job at, is marrying those two things. So when it comes to character, what are your thoughts on it, and how do you feel about this shift in the industry?
Well, I'll go back to Samuel R. Delaney's Nova, actually, and this is going to be sort of about character. I'll get to it in a bit.
Okay.
And it was a mix. The thing about Nova is there's a ship which is captained by an aristocrat, but the crew are all working class stiffs. And as a working class kid, I went click, click, click. You know, that there were these people, you know, who were just doing a day's work for a day's pay. And it's kind of the world that I was more familiar with, rather than the princes and princesses and the mad scientists and inventors and their beautiful daughters and the dashing gallant space captain, etc., 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 of the old classic stuff. So that influence on me was to write more sort of about ordinary people caught up in extraordinary affairs, as it were. And yeah, there might be in the Quiet War there is a kind of mad scientist who does villainous things, but the other point is about villains is the obvious one, is that nobody gets up thinking, what villainous thing shall I do today, rubbing hands. You know, obviously they think that they're doing something that is worthwhile, and everybody else is wrong, or they've allied themselves with a particular cause that they don't see as evil. I mean, if you look at the current thing that's going on between Russia and the Ukraine, Ukraine, sorry, not the Ukraine. There's an obvious point there that are the Russians evil or not? Well, they don't think they are, and so that was a good lesson for me. And I think that from a point of view of characterization is that you don't have this, you have a mix of different characters from different viewpoints. And when it comes to world building, which is also something that involves characters for me, is you look at the maps of Europa or whatever, but when it comes down to it, you're looking at what the characters experience in terms of world building, and what they see, what they're interested in, what they have to overcome, that kind of thing. And also moments of being, not doing, like everyday life, which is quite often absent in the great noise and vast landscapes of space opera, is, you know, sweeping out your little cabin, things like that. So I that's where I got my interest from. I think going back to this thing about the character is called Mouse, and he was like this tramp wandering around and occasionally getting a job on a ship, except it happened to be a starship, not a tramp steamer, you know. And did he have a relationship, a gay relationship with Captain Lork, I think, or not? Who knows? But they're very close. And it was this kind of thing of the high and the low that got me interested in, which is also a very noir-y kind. If you go back to noir fiction, very noir thing, and you can reveal great moments of change from the perspective of characters caught up in it. So yeah. So
no,
you can,
I like
you
that.
can do that as much as get on with the various other things. So obviously things like romance and all those other things are yes, getting to be more important, and you can foreground all that stuff as well, and have science too. Why not?
Exactly. Yeah, just to have like
scientists are people, you know.
Yeah. Don't make them evil. You know, Adrian's probably over there twirling his fingers and cackling, but. Who, me? No. But I love that there's this ability to transcend the scope through granular details and things that we can relate to, from whether it be like working class or whether it be the representation of a certain background or heritage or ethnicity or what have you. And Nia, since you were the one that brought up this character focus to begin with, I want you to close us out.
I think I tend to write characters that are very bold and very expressive, and even in these like expansive like fantasy worlds with these you know, really like huge and like intricate plots, it always starts from characters who are intricately linked and have, volumes of history before page one, of, my stories ever start. And so then all of the, I guess, the world building and the tension and the conflict that's driving the narrative from beginning to end, a lot of it was laid through these intricate back histories, and these like interconnected, big, bold personalities.
Mhm.
And then, so then when they get on page, you're seeing the clash of those extreme personalities, and that's what's driving the story forward. So I'm very much like a character writer. My characters spring forth before the rest of the world starts to take shape, and the setting and the world building and the little intricacies, and all of the dressings, they are there to serve the characters and their arcs.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. And all of you, thank you so much for, sharing your wisdom with me today, sharing some laughs. But for me personally, you five and so many other writers out there are exemplars of why this current age is, for me personally, and probably for many people, a new golden age of space opera. And I think there are so many amazing stories being told right now, so many amazing stories to come. And I know all of you will be continuing to champion space opera in its many, many forms. Just to close out, I'm going to ask each of you to share your latest book, if you want to promote some new releases, as well your social media. And if you could give a recommendation, I know we've had a lot of recommendations sprinkled in here, but one more doesn't hurt. Another recommendation of a space opera film, book, TV show that you want to share with people. So Adrian, I'll start with you.
Okay, my latest sci-fi book is Children of Memory, which is the third book of that Children of series that started with the Spider one. I've also got a fantasy book out, which is City of Last Chances, which I'm reading from, I think, tomorrow.
Yes.
If people want to tune into that.
Well,
for recommendations, you know what? I am going to go back to something we've mentioned already. The Yoon-Ha Lee's series that starts with Nine Fox Gambit is absolutely incredible.
Mm-hmm.
It is really, it's brilliant. It's very, it has a lot of very strong characterization, but also just the universe it is set in. It has so many bizarre ideas. It's great.
Yeah, I agree. And Adrian, where can people find you on social media?
Oh, I'm at Apt Shadow on Twitter and Mastodon, and I'm AdrianTchaikovsky.com on my for my own website.
Perfect, thank you. And Paul, if you could give a recommendation and social media and let us know your latest work.
Okay, well, the latest book is Beyond the Burn Line, which is post-Anthropocene, post-human Earth. Or is it post-human? Well, let's find out and read the book. And what are we doing? Recommendation? How about M. John Harrison's Light Trilogy, which is very Marmite-y. People tend to either love it or hate it. So I'll throw that one out there. What's the other thing you asked me there, Adrian?
Social media or website.
Oh, social media. Oh, you can find me as Unlikely Worlds in various guises on various platforms.
Amazing. I really appreciate using Marmite as a comparison.
Or Vegemite, if we got any Australian.
There you go.
But everybody in Australia likes Vegemite. You have to. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. And Jonathan, what about you? Latest work, recommendation, and social media.
Sure. Stellar Instinct came out in December, so that's a standalone spy-fi thriller in a space opera setting. And you can find me at jnavarre on Twitter and Instagram and everywhere else pretty much. Recommendation, I'm going to go with You Sexy Thing by Kat Rambo, which I'm about halfway through right now and very much enjoying. And there's a wonderful kind of a balance between that scale and intimacy in there that's really a lot of fun and also quite intriguing.
Excellent. And Aliette?
Sure. My latest book is The Red Scholar's Wake, which is lesbian pirates romance in outer space. What was that recommendation? I'm going to go with Thaddeus Thompson's Far From the Light of Heaven, which is a wonderful kind of locked ship mystery, I guess, set on a generation ship. Sorry, not on a ship. And social media, I'm at Aliette DB on Instagram, Mastodon, and also slightly on Twitter, but not so much these days. And http:/aliette.com, basically, for my website.
Right on. And Aliette's got a good Substack if you want to go check that out too.
Oh no, sorry, my newsletter is now no longer on Substack. It's on.
Oh, no?
It's self-hosted. Yeah.
Oh, perfect.
I forgot to close down the Substack. Sorry.
This is a reminder.
Yes, clearly.
Go close that up. Awesome. Thank you. And Nia?
My book is The Blood Trials. It came out this past April. It is about a Black woman growing up in an incredibly racist and sexist society. She undergoes these military trials on an entirely different planet to try to find out who killed her grandfather and get vengeance. The sequel, the conclusion to that duology is out this coming April. It is called The Blood Gift, a book that I probably read way too much, like literally multiple times a year. I just pulled it off of my bookshelf and that's why I have it. But Polaris Rising by Jesse Mihalik is just a pure fun space opera romance. And even if romance isn't for you, just the intrigue and the world building is phenomenal. And it's one of the books I go back to over and over again because I absolutely adore it. Social media, on Twitter, I am Nia_Davenport. My website is nedavenport.com. If Instagram is your thing, I'm Nia.Davenport there.
Wonderful. And I'll throw a recommendation out there as well. Gareth L. Powell, his recent release, Stars and Bones, is a ton of fun. His older stuff too is amazing, the Embers of War series and everything, but Stars and Bones I feel like is a good introduction to Gareth's work. Very fast-paced, very good character work, amazing science, and some pretty fucked up, brutal aliens doing really awful things, but it's very good, so I highly recommend that. And Adrian, Paul, Nia, Aliette, and Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time to do this panel with me, for participating in TBRCon 2023. Thank you everyone out there for watching. I really appreciate it, and see you all soon.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you.
Thank you.